3 days later, Jake Morrison sat his horse on a ridge overlooking Devil's Fork, counting cattle as his scattered crew drove their gathered herds toward the meeting point. The sight before him was better than he'd dared hope. Hundreds of longhorns streaming through the valley below, guided by cowboys who'd worked harder than any men should have to work. Tommy Rodriguez arrived first, pushing a herd of nearly 200 head with Billy Hutchins and Frank Morales flanking the cattle to keep them bunched tight. The young cowboy looked like he'd aged 5 years in 3 days, his face burned dark by the sun, and his clothes torn from fighting through brush and broken country. But his eyes were bright with pride as he rode up to Jake. Found most of them holed up in Box Canyon, about 15 miles north, Tommy reported, his voice hoarse from shouting at stubborn cattle. They'd been drinking from a spring up there, living fat and happy while we worried ourselves sick about them. Jake smiled at the boy's enthusiasm. 3 days of gathering scattered cattle in rough country had taught Tommy Rodriguez more about cowboy work than a month of routine trail driving could have done. The flood had been a disaster, but it had also been an education for all of them. "Cookies coming in from the east," said Frank Morales, pointing toward a dust cloud on the horizon. "Looks like he's got a good-sized bunch with him, too." Sure enough, the old cook appeared 20 minutes later, driving nearly 150 head with Sam Wheeler and Red Thompson working the flanks. Cookie himself looked exhausted, but satisfied as he rode up to Jake's position on the ridge. "Found them scattered all through them breaks and draws," Cookie reported. "Some of them had wandered damn near to the Brazos River before we caught up. But Red here can track a ghost through a snowstorm. And Sam's got the best cutting horse I ever seen. We got every last one of them that didn't get swept downstream in the flood." Jake did a quick count in his head. Nearly 600 head gathered, which was better than his most optimistic estimate. They'd lost 200 cattle to the flood and the scatter, plus their chuck wagon and most of their supplies. But 600 longhorns were still worth a considerable sum at the Fort Worth stockyards, enough to make the drive profitable and pay the crew their promised wages. "All right, boys," Jake called to the assembled crew. "We've done good work these past 3 days. Better than good. We've done something most folks would have said was impossible. Now we've got the hardest part still ahead of us. 3 weeks to Fort Worth with no wagon and precious little food." The men gathered around him in a loose circle, their faces reflecting the weariness and determination that had carried them through the crisis. These weren't the same cowboys who'd left Amarillo 2 weeks ago. The flood and its aftermath had forged them into something harder, more resilient, more united than any crew Jake had ever bossed. "We're going to travel fast and light," Jake continued. "No more leisurely drives with long noon stops. We'll push these cattle from dawn to dusk, cover 20 miles a day if the country allows it. We've got to reach Fort Worth before we starve to death or before winter weather catches us out here in the open." Cookie Williams had been doing calculations of his own during the gather. "I've been thinking about our food situation," he said. "If we're careful, real careful, we can stretch what we got for maybe 10 days. That leaves us short by a week or more, depending on how fast we can push these cattle. Then we'll have to live off the land," said Jake simply. "Hunt what we can, forage what we can find, and tighten our belts when there's nothing else to do. Cowboys have survived on less before." Miguel Santos spoke up from where he was checking his rigging. "My grandfather used to tell stories about the old days, when the vaqueros would drive cattle from Chihuahua to California. Sometimes they'd go weeks with nothing but what they could catch or kill along the way. Said it made men out of boys and separated the real cowboys from the pretenders." "Well, we're about to find out which kind we are," said Jake with a grin that didn't quite hide his own concerns. "Mount up, boys. We've got cattle to move and miles to cover before dark." The combined herd was larger and more difficult to handle than their original 800 head had been. The cattle were spooky from their experience with the flood, quick to scatter at any unexpected sound or movement. It took all the skill and experience of the 12-man crew to keep them moving in the right direction. Jake rode point, setting the pace and choosing the route through country that seemed determined to slow them down. The recent rains had turned every low spot into a muddy bog, and the cattle balked at crossing even the smallest streams. What should have been a routine day's drive turned into a grueling test of patience and endurance. By evening, They'd covered only 12 miles instead of the 20 Jake had hoped for. The cattle were tired and fractious, and the men were hollow-eyed with exhaustion. They made camp beside a small creek that provided good water for the herd, but the surrounding country was picked clean of anything edible. Supper was a thin stew made from the last of their salt pork, stretched with wild onions, and some questionable greens that Cookie swore were edible. It wasn't much, but it put something hot in their bellies and gave them strength for the night watch. Found deer sign about 2 miles east of here, reported Pete Dawson, who'd been scouting while the others made camp. Fresh tracks leading into that oak grove by the big bend in the creek. If we're lucky, maybe we can get some meat tomorrow. Jake nodded, but he was already thinking ahead to the challenges that lay between them and Fort Worth. 20 days of hard travel through country that was becoming more settled as they moved east. They'd have to cross the Brazos River, navigate around growing towns and farming settlements, and somehow keep 600 half-wild longhorns moving steadily toward market. The next morning brought the first real test of their resolve. Pete Dawson returned from his hunt empty-handed, reporting that the deer had moved on during the night. Cookie served up the last of their coffee along with Johnny cakes, so thin they were barely more than flavored water. "That's it for coffee," Cookie announced grimly. "From here on, it's water and whatever we can shoot or find growing wild." The men took the news without complaint, though Jake could see the disappointment in their faces. Coffee was more than just a drink to cowboys. It was ritual, comfort, and liquid courage all rolled into one. Starting the day without it felt like going into battle without ammunition. But they mounted up anyway and pushed the herd eastward through country that grew more challenging with each passing mile. The cattle were getting harder to handle as their own hunger and fatigue mounted. Several times during the morning, small groups broke away from the main herd and had to be chased down and brought back. It was Tommy Rodriguez who spotted the smoke rising from a small homestead about 5 miles off their route. Jake studied the distant buildings through his field glasses, weighing the risks and benefits of making contact with the settlers. "Might be willing to trade for some supplies," suggested Cookie hopefully. "Folks out here don't see many travelers. They might welcome the chance to do business." Jake made his decision quickly. "Tommy, you and Billy come with me. The rest of you keep the herd moving east. We'll catch up before evening." The homestead turned out to belong to a German immigrant family named Mueller, who'd been trying to scratch a living from the hard Texas soil for 3 years. Hans Mueller was a big, weathered man with kind eyes and hands like anvils from years of breaking prairie sod with nothing but a team of oxen and an iron plow. His wife Greta was a small, efficient woman who took one look at the 3 hungry cowboys and immediately started preparing food without being asked. Their 2 children, a boy of about 10 and a girl slightly younger, watched the visitors with wide eyes from the safety of their mother's skirts. "We had flood too," Hans explained in accented English as they sat around the family's rough-hewn table. "Lost half our corn crop, most of our chickens. But we got through it, same as you will." The Muellers didn't have much to spare, but they shared what they could: a sack of cornmeal, some dried beans, and a precious few pounds of salt pork. In return, Jake gave them 2 of the weaker cattle that had been struggling to keep up with the herd. It was a fair trade that benefited both parties, but more than that, it reminded Jake and his men that there were still good people in the world, folks who would help a stranger in need without asking for anything in return. "You be careful out there," Greta Mueller warned as they prepared to leave. "We heard talk of Comanche raiders to the north, and there's been trouble with rustlers along the cattle trails. Bad men who think it's easier to steal cattle than to work for an honest living." Jake thanked the woman for the warning, though he'd been expecting trouble of that sort. The frontier was full of desperate men who saw a small crew driving valuable cattle as an easy target. The key was to be ready for trouble without looking for it, to be strong enough to defend what was theirs without starting unnecessary fights. They rejoined the herd just before sunset, and Cookie immediately started planning how to stretch their new supplies to last as long as possible. The cornmeal alone would add several days to their food reserves, and the salt pork would provide flavor and protein for the thin stews that had become their standard fare. That night, as Jake took his turn at guard duty, riding slowly around the bedded herd under a star-filled sky, He reflected on how much had changed since the flood. His crew had been tested in ways he'd never imagined, forced to dig deeper and work harder than any men should have to work. But they'd come through it together, and that meant something important. They weren't just employees anymore, working for wages and counting the days until they could head home. They'd become a true outfit, bound together by shared hardship and mutual dependence. The cattle stirred restlessly in the darkness, sensing the presence of predators in the surrounding brush. Jake loosened his rifle in its saddle scabbard and rode a little closer to the herd, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of danger. A coyote yapped somewhere in the distance, answered by another from a different direction. Normal sounds of the frontier night, nothing to worry about. But Jake had learned to trust his instincts, and something felt different about this night. There was a tension in the air, a feeling that trouble was coming whether they were ready for it or not. He was right. Just before dawn, as the eastern sky was beginning to lighten and the cattle were starting to stir, the attack came. Not from Comanche raiders or wild animals, but from something worse. A gang of rustlers who'd been following the herd for days, waiting for the right moment to strike. The first shot rang out just as Cookie was starting the breakfast fire, followed immediately by the thunder of hoofbeats as a dozen armed men charged the camp from 3 different directions. But Jake Morrison and his crew were ready for them. They'd been expecting trouble, and they didn't intend to go down without a fight. The final test of their journey was about to begin, and everything they'd learned about courage, loyalty, and determination would be put to the ultimate test. In the growing light of dawn, with the sound of gunfire echoing across the Texas plains, Jake Morrison prepared to defend his herd, his men, and his word with everything he had. Dawn broke gray and misty over the muddy valley, revealing the full scope of what the flood had taken from them. Jake Morrison stood on the hillside, sipping weak coffee from a dented tin cup while surveying the wreckage below. Broken trees lay scattered like matchsticks, and the creek that had been a trickle yesterday now ran bankful with brown water that would take days to recede. Found tracks heading north, reported Billy Hutchins, one of the older hands who'd been scouting since before sunrise. Looks like maybe 100 head went that way, probably more scattered through those canyons. Jake nodded, mentally calculating the work ahead. The Rockingham crew had been hired to deliver 800 head of longhorn cattle to the stockyards in Fort Worth. They'd already lost at least 50 in the flood, maybe more. Every cow that didn't make it to market meant money out of everyone's pocket, but more than that, it meant Jake's reputation as a trail boss would take a hit. In the cattle business, reputation was everything. Word traveled fast along the cow towns and shipping points. A trail boss who lost too many cattle, who couldn't handle trouble when it came, would find himself out of work mighty quick. Jake had spent 15 years building his name, and he wasn't about to let one flood destroy what he'd worked so hard to create. "Cookie, what's our food situation?" Jake asked, though he already knew the answer wouldn't be good. The old cook squatted by their meager fire, stirring a pot of thin beans with some wild onions he'd foraged that morning. His weathered face was grim as he took stock of their remaining supplies. "Coffee's gonna be gone in 3 days, for if we stretch it thin. Got enough beans and flour for maybe a week, but that's feeding 12 hungry men who've been working cattle from dawn to dusk." "What about hunting?" asked Tommy Rodriguez, who was cleaning his rifle with the careful attention of a man who knew his life might depend on it. "This country's been hunted pretty heavy by the Comanche and the buffalo hunters," said Jake. "Might find some deer in the rough country to the north, maybe a few rabbits. But we can't count on game to keep us fed all the way to Fort Worth." The truth was harder than Jake wanted to admit. They were in serious trouble, the kind of trouble that could turn deadly fast if they made the wrong choices. 3 weeks of trail stretched ahead of them, through country that could be unforgiving even under the best circumstances. Without the chuck wagon and its supplies, they were walking a tightrope between survival and disaster. "We could turn back," suggested Billy Hutchins, voicing what several of the men were probably thinking. "Cut our losses, head for home, and try again next season." Jake studied the faces of his crew. These were good men, experienced cowboys who knew the risks of the trail. They'd signed on for a cattle drive, not a survival test in the wilderness. If they wanted to head back, he couldn't blame them for it. But As Jake looked at each man in turn, he saw something that surprised him. Instead of fear or doubt, he saw determination. Cookie Williams was already planning how to stretch their meager rations. Tommy Rodriguez was checking his saddle gear, getting ready for a long, hard ride. Billy Hutchins might have mentioned turning back, but his hands were busy rigging a pack frame to carry supplies on horseback. "We could turn back," Jake agreed quietly. "But we gave our word we'd deliver this herd. Besides, there's 12 families back home counting on the money from this drive. Cookie's got grandchildren he's never seen because he's been saving every penny to visit them in California. Tommy's sending money to his folks in San Antonio. Every man here has got reasons to see this through." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I won't lie to you. This is going to be the hardest thing any of us has ever done. We're going to be hungry, tired, and pushed to our limits. But I believe we can make it if we stick together and don't quit when things get tough." Old Cookie Williams spoke up from beside the fire. "I've been cooking for Cowboys for 30 years, and I ain't never seen a crew that couldn't survive on beans and rabbit stew if they had to. We got good horses, good ropes, and better men. That's more than a lot of folks have." One by one, the other men nodded their agreement. They were cowboys, after all, men who'd chosen a life of hardship and uncertainty because they valued freedom more than comfort. The trail had always been dangerous, and they'd all known that when they signed on. "All right then," said Jake, feeling a surge of pride in his crew. "Here's how we're going to do this. We'll split into 3 groups. Tommy, you take Billy and Frank and work those canyons to the north. Find every cow you can and push them toward the old Indian trail that runs along the ridge. Cookie, you and Sam and Red will gather what cattle scattered to the east. I'll take the rest of the boys and work the rough country to the west." He pulled out a piece of charcoal from the fire and sketched a rough map on a flat rock. "We'll meet up at Devil's Fork, right here, in 3 days. That should give us time to round up most of the cattle and get organized for the push to Fort Worth." "What about supplies?" asked Tommy. "We can't all carry enough food for 3 days of hard riding." Jake had already thought about that. "We'll travel light. Each group takes what they need for 1 day, plus coffee and hardtack for emergencies. We live off what we can hunt and forage, and we make every shot count. Anyone who sees deer sign, you track it down. Anyone finds wild fruit or nuts, you gather what you can." It was a risky plan, splitting up the crew when they were already in trouble. But Jake knew they didn't have a choice. The cattle were scattered over miles of rough country, and they needed to gather them fast before the animals drifted too far from the trail. Every day they delayed meant fewer cattle recovered and less chance of reaching Fort Worth before their supplies ran out completely. The groups split up after a quick breakfast of thin coffee and the last of their bacon. Jake watched Tommy Rodriguez ride north with Billy and Frank, the young cowboy sitting straight and confident in his saddle despite the challenges ahead. The boy had grown up fast in the last 24 hours, and Jake could see the makings of a real trail hand in him. Jake's group consisted of himself, Miguel Santos, Pete Dawson, and Jim Fletcher, 4 experienced cowboys who'd been working together for years. They knew each other's strengths and weaknesses, could communicate with a look or a gesture, and could handle just about anything the trail might throw at them. The rough country to the west was a maze of arroyos, mesas, and hidden valleys that could hide cattle for weeks if you didn't know where to look. Jake did know, though. He'd driven herds through this country before, and he understood how cattle thought when they were scared and scattered. They found the first bunch in a box canyon about 5 miles from their camp. 30 head of longhorns bunched up tight against the back wall like they were trying to hide from the memory of the flood. The cattle were spooky and wild-eyed, but they settled down once they recognized the familiar sight and sound of cowboys working around them. "Easy does it," Jake murmured to his horse as they eased into the canyon. "Let's not get these critters any more excited than they already are." Miguel Santos was the best rope hand Jake had ever seen, a vaquero from Old Mexico who could drop a loop over a running steer's horns from 50 yards away. He and Pete Dawson worked the sides of the canyon while Jake and Jim Fletcher blocked the mouth, preventing the cattle from bolting back toward the broken country. It took 2 hours of careful, patient work to gather the cattle and pushed them out of the canyon toward the meeting point at Devil's Fork. 2 hours that felt like 10, with the sun beating down and the smell of mud and wet earth rising from the ground. But when they finally had the cattle strung out and moving in the right direction, Jake felt a surge of satisfaction that almost made up for their losses. They found more cattle throughout the day, a dozen head here, 20 there, singles and pairs hidden in every draw and gully. It was slow, tedious work that required all their skill and experience. These weren't gentle dairy cows, but half-wild longhorns with horns that could span 6 feet and temperaments to match. One wrong move, one moment of carelessness, and a man could find himself on the ground with a ton of angry beef trying to trample him into the mud. By evening, Jake's group had gathered nearly 200 head, more than he'd dared hope for. They made a dry camp in a protected valley, with the cattle bedded down under the watchful eyes of the night guards. Supper was jackrabbit that Miguel had shot with his old Spencer carbine, seasoned with wild sage and roasted over a fire of buffalo chips. It wasn't much, but it was food, and after a day of hard riding, even tough jackrabbit tasted better than the finest steak in San Antonio. Jake chewed slowly, making each bite last, while he planned the next day's gather. Found sign of maybe 50 more head up in them breaks to the north, reported Pete Dawson, who'd been scouting while the others made camp. Tracks are fresh, probably not more than a day old. We should be able to catch up to them tomorrow if we start early. Jake nodded, already calculating distances and timing in his head. If they could gather 50 more cattle tomorrow, and if the other groups had similar luck, they might recover 600 head or more. It would still be a loss, but not a disaster. They could make it to Fort Worth with 600 head, especially if they pushed hard and didn't lose any more along the way. But that was a lot of ifs, and Jake had been in the cattle business long enough to know that things rarely went according to plan. Weather could turn bad again, cattle could scatter, men or horses could get injured. A dozen things could go wrong between here and Fort Worth, and most of them would cost them time, money, or both. As he rolled up in his blanket beside the dying fire, Jake thought about the choice he'd made that morning. They could have turned back, could have cut their losses, and headed home to try again another season. It would have been the safe choice, the smart choice by most people's reckoning. But safety had never been what drew Jake Morrison to the cattle trail. He'd been born to a hard life on a hardscrabble farm in East Texas, where every day was a struggle just to put food on the table. His father had died when Jake was 14, leaving him to support his mother and 2 younger sisters by whatever work he could find. He'd worked as a farmhand, a freight wagon driver, a buffalo hunter, and finally, a cowboy. Each job had taught him something about life, about what it meant to be a man in a country that didn't give a damn whether you lived or died. The most important lesson he'd learned was that when you gave your word, you kept it, no matter what the cost. The cattle business was built on trust. A man's word was his bond, and once that bond was broken, it could never be fully repaired. Jake had promised to deliver 800 head of cattle to Fort Worth, and he meant to keep that promise even if it killed him. Because in the end, that's what separated the men from the boys out here on the frontier, the willingness to do what you said you'd do, regardless of the consequences. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of their resolve and determination. But tonight, listening to the cattle settle down for the night, and the soft murmur of conversation from the night guards, Jake felt a quiet confidence that they would see this through. They had lost their wagon and most of their supplies, but they still had something more valuable than any material possession. They had each other, and the unbreakable bond that forms between men who face danger together and refuse to quit. The stars came out bright and clear above the camp, no longer hidden by the storm clouds that had brought so much destruction. Jake took that as a good sign as he drifted off to sleep, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt revolver and his ears tuned to the peaceful sounds of cattle at rest. Tomorrow would test them again, but they'd proven they could survive whatever the trail threw at them. Now they just had to prove they could thrive. The morning sun painted the Texas plains gold when Jake Morrison pulled his hat down tight and squinted at the dark clouds gathering on the horizon. He'd been driving cattle for 15 years, and those clouds meant trouble. The kind of trouble that could turn a routine drive into a fight for survival. "Storm's coming in fast," called out Tommy Rodriguez, one of the younger hands riding alongside the chuck wagon. The boy couldn't have been more than 19, with eager eyes and hands that still shook a little when lightning cracked overhead. Jake nodded but kept his focus on the terrain ahead. They were pushing through the low country between Amarillo and Fort Worth, following the old cattle trails that generations of cowboys had worn into the earth. The herd of 800 longhorns stretched out behind them like a river of horns and hide, guided by 12 riders who knew their business. Cookie Williams drove the chuck wagon, his weathered face creased with worry as he watched the sky. The wagon carried everything the outfit needed to survive on the trail: beans, bacon, coffee, flour, and the precious sourdough starter that Cookie guarded like gold. More importantly, it carried the medical supplies and extra ammunition that could mean the difference between life and death out here in the wilderness. "Jake," Cookie's voice carried over the rumble of thunder. "We need to find high ground. This looks like a real gully washer coming our way." But Jake had already spotted the problem. They were in a natural basin, with rolling hills on both sides and a dry creek bed running parallel to their path. If the rain came down hard in the hills, that creek would turn into a rushing torrent faster than a man could blink. He'd seen it happen before, back in '89, when 3 good men and 50 head of cattle got swept away in a flash flood. The first drops of rain hit like bullets, cold and hard against their faces. Within minutes, the drops became a steady downpour. Then, a driving torrent that turned the world gray and made it hard to see more than 20 feet in any direction. "Get those cattle moving," Jake shouted over the roar of the storm. "Head for those hills to the north." The cowboys sprang into action, whistling and calling to the herd. But cattle are stubborn creatures, especially when they're scared. Thunder crashed overhead, and lightning split the sky like a giant's whip. The longhorns began to mill and shift nervously, their eyes rolling white with fear. That's when Jake heard it, a low rumble from the west that had nothing to do with thunder. He turned in his saddle and saw a wall of muddy water racing down the creek bed, carrying tree branches, rocks, and debris in its churning grip. The flash flood was moving faster than a galloping horse, and it was heading straight for them. "Flash flood!" Jake screamed, his voice cutting through the storm. "Everyone to high ground." Now, the cowboys didn't need to be told twice. They spurred their horses and began driving the cattle toward the hills with desperate urgency. But the chuck wagon was in trouble. Cookie's team of 4 mules were fighting the traces, terrified by the storm and the approaching flood. The wagon wheels were already sinking into the muddy ground, making it harder for the animals to pull their precious cargo to safety. Jake saw the situation in an instant. The flood would reach the wagon before Cookie could get clear. Without those supplies, the outfit would be stranded in the wilderness with no food, no medicine, and no way to survive the long journey ahead. But more than that, Cookie Williams had been like a father to every cowboy who'd ever ridden for the Rockingham Ranch. The old man had pulled Jake through a bout of pneumonia 3 winters back, sitting up all night to make sure he didn't die of fever. Most men would have calculated the odds and headed for safety. The smart thing would be to save yourself and hope for the best. But Jake Morrison wasn't most men. He'd been raised by a father who believed that you stood by your friends, no matter what. His mother had taught him that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but doing what was right even when you were scared to death. Jake wheeled his horse around and drove his spurs deep. The big roan gelding leaped forward through the mud and driving rain, carrying his rider straight toward the struggling wagon. Behind them, the wall of water grew higher and louder with each passing second. "Cookie!" Jake yelled as he reached the wagon. "Cut the traces. Turn the mules loose." The old cook's fingers fumbled with the wet leather straps that held the mules to the wagon. His hands were shaking from cold and fear, making the simple task nearly impossible. Jake could see the terror in Cookie's eyes as the roar of the approaching flood grew louder. Without hesitation, Jake swung down from his horse and pulled his knife from his belt. The razor-sharp blade sliced through the leather traces like they were made of paper. The 4 mules, suddenly free, bolted toward higher ground with their ears pinned back and their eyes wide with panic. "Grab what you can," Jake shouted, already pulling sacks of flour and beans from the wagon bed. We got maybe 30 seconds. Cookie moved faster than Jake had seen him move in years, his survival instincts overriding his age and the arthritis that usually slowed him down. Together, they grabbed armloads of supplies: the coffee, the medical kit, ammunition, and Cookie's precious sourdough starter. They couldn't save everything, but they could save enough to keep the outfit alive. The flood hit just as they threw the last of the salvaged supplies onto Jake's horse. The wall of water slammed into the chuck wagon with the force of a runaway train, lifting the heavy vehicle like it was made of paper and hurling it downstream in a tangle of broken wood and scattered pots and pans. Jake grabbed Cookie around the waist and hauled the older man up behind him on the roan. The horse staggered under the double load, but gamely fought through the rising water toward the hillside where the rest of the crew waited. Water swirled around the horse's legs, then his belly, as the flood spread across the low ground like a brown lake. For a terrifying moment, Jake thought they weren't going to make it. The current grabbed at the horse's legs, trying to sweep them downstream with the wagon and everything else the flood had claimed. But the roan was a cow horse, bred and trained for tough work, and he wasn't about to quit now. With powerful strokes of his legs, he fought through the churning water until they reached the muddy slope of the hill. Tommy Rodriguez and two other cowboys grabbed Cookie and helped him up the slope to safety. Jake's horse scrambled up behind them, his sides heaving and his coat streaming with muddy water. They'd made it, but just barely. From their perch on the hillside, the crew watched in stunned silence as the flood swept through the valley below. Trees that had stood for decades were uprooted and carried away like sticks. The creek that had been bone dry that morning was now a raging river 50 yards wide, carrying debris and destruction toward the distant Colorado River. "Holy hell, Jake," breathed Cookie, his voice shaking as he stared at the spot where his wagon had been. "You saved my life. If you hadn't come back." Jake just nodded, still breathing hard from the effort and the adrenaline. He wasn't one for speeches, and he didn't see what he'd done as particularly heroic. It was just what you did for a friend, what any decent man would do when someone needed help. But as he looked around at the faces of his crew, Jake could see something different in their eyes. Respect, sure, but more than that. These men had always known Jake was a good cowboy and a fair boss, but now they'd seen something else. They'd seen a man who would risk his own life to save a friend, who would ride straight into danger when others needed help. The storm raged for another hour, but gradually the thunder moved east, and the rain slackened to a steady drizzle. The flood began to recede, leaving behind a landscape of mud and debris that looked nothing like the peaceful valley they'd ridden into that morning. "We lost most of our supplies," said Cookie, taking inventory of what they'd managed to save. "Got enough coffee for maybe a week, some beans, a little flour. Not much for 12 men, and a month on the trail. We'll make do," Jake replied, though he knew the old cook was right to worry. They were still 3 weeks from Fort Worth, and without the chuck wagon, they'd have to live off what they could hunt and the little food they'd managed to save. It would be tight, maybe tighter than tight. "What about the cattle?" asked young Tommy. The herd had scattered during the flood, spooked by the storm and the rushing water. Some of them were visible on the far side of the valley, but many had disappeared into the hills and ravines that dotted the landscape. "We'll round them up," Jake said with more confidence than he felt. "Cattle always head for high ground when there's trouble. They'll be bunched up in the draws and hollows, waiting for the water to go down." It sounded simple enough, but Jake knew it would take days to gather the scattered herd. Days they couldn't afford to lose if they wanted to reach Fort Worth before their supplies ran out completely. And that was assuming they could find all the cattle, which was far from certain in this broken country. As the crew made camp on the hillside that night, huddled around a small fire and sharing what little food they had, Jake stared out at the muddy valley below and tried to calculate their chances. They'd lost their wagon, most of their supplies, and probably 50 head of cattle or more. Any reasonable man would turn back, cut his losses, and try again next season. But Jake Morrison had given his word to deliver this herd to Fort Worth, and his word meant something. More than that, he had 11 men depending on him to get them home safe. Cookie Williams, who'd cooked for cowboys for 30 years and deserved to retire with a little money in his pocket. Tommy Rodriguez, who was sending his wages back to his family in San Antonio. The others, good men all, who'd signed on for this drive because they trusted Jake to see them through. The fire crackled and hissed in the damp air, and, somewhere in the darkness, a coyote howled its lonesome song. Jake pulled his blanket tighter around his shoulders and made his decision. They'd lost the wagon, but they still had their horses, their ropes, and their skills. More importantly, they had each other. Tomorrow they'd start the long, hard work of gathering the scattered cattle and figuring out how to survive on the trail without a chuck wagon. It wouldn't be easy, but then, again, nothing worthwhile ever was. Jake had learned that lesson a long time ago, back when he was Tommy's age, and thought the world owed him something just for being alive. The rain had stopped completely now, and a few stars were beginning to show through the breaking clouds. Jake took that as a good sign. His father had always said that after every storm, the sun comes out again. You just had to have faith and keep moving forward, one step at a time. As he drifted off to sleep, Jake could hear Cookie moving around the camp, checking on the men, and making sure everyone was as comfortable as possible under the circumstances. The old cook might have lost his wagon and most of his supplies, but he hadn't lost his sense of duty to the crew. That kind of dedication was worth more than all the coffee and beans in Texas. Jake smiled to himself as sleep finally took him. They had a hard road ahead, but they'd travel it together. And with men like Cookie Williams and young Tommy Rodriguez beside him, Jake reckoned they had a fighting chance of making it through. After all, they'd already survived the worst that Mother Nature could throw at them. How much harder could the rest of the trail be?